I'm going to show you how I took this knockoff train and turned it into a wooden railway-sized replica of one of the fastest trains of the 1900s. So we come to our base, which was a wooden railway counterfeit Molly and Gordon I ordered from AliExpress. What I like about knockoffs is that they're cheap and they're easy to rip apart. My original plan was to take the front of Gordon and combine it with the back of Molly to get that perfect Truro look. But I first came to some problems. As hardcore fans may be familiar with, the width of Gordon's running board is thinner than Molly's, so that idea got thrown out the window and I opted to just use the boiler from Gordon. Moving back to Molly, I completely cut off her cab. The gaps and imperfections were filled in with wood filler and I started constructing a new cab out of wood scraps I had on hand. A new longer running board was also made with more wood scraps that were luckily the same with thickness of Molly. The firebox was also a lot smaller than I anticipated, so I put a small piece of wood under a piece of poster board to add to its height. Cheap and nasty superglue was used to coat the card so it would stay in place and harden. Once all the pieces were in place, filler was added to, as you would expect, to fill the gaps and was later sanded down, leading to a silky smooth surface. Back to the boiler, I decided to completely scrap using Gordon's boiler as it was more of an oval shape rather than a perfect circle, completely throwing Gordon out the window. Instead, I opted to use a PVC pipe I had on hand. Unfortunately, it ended up being a bit too thin, but it looked the part so I couldn't complain. A hole was drilled into it for the safety valve, which also came from Molly, ironically using her dome. It was simply flipped upside down to give the appearance of a safety valve. Next was to tackle one of the trickiest parts of the model, which was the slope that goes from the firebox to the boiler. To achieve this, I used a mix of Mod Podge and Crayola Model Magic Clay. Now in this situation, Milliput would have been the ideal option, but I only wanted to use what I had on hand at that time. To my surprise, it actually worked much better than I expected. There was a crack that formed, but it was later filled in with Mod Podge and super glue, and you can't even see it now. Moving to the smoke box, it was a little short compared to the new height of the boiler, so an elevated base was made using poster board and super glue. The little things that poke out from the side of the smoke box were also made with poster board and lathered with cheap and nasty super glue to stay in place. I have no idea what these are called. Now that the construction of Turo's body was basically done, I moved to the tender, which was definitely less complex. The tender was removed from the chassis, and after getting sanded down, new side panels were made from, you guessed it, more poster board. And as is the case with all the poster boards used on this project, cheap superglue was used to harden it. This was probably the easiest part of the model to do and probably my favorite due to how clean it came out. I mean, look at that. Perfection. Well, maybe not perfection, but you know, I mean, looks good enough, I guess. During the process, I realized that the city of Truro had a portion of its wheels covered by a side plate, so aiming for accuracy, I attempted to add it with mine. Now, major spoiler alert, I ended up removing it as the wheels wouldn't be able to fit on with the chassis. And I'm kinda glad I did because it really looked off. To make up for it and to achieve a similar look, a piece of poster board was made to connect the wheel arch to the running board while still allowing the wheels to freely turn.
Amazing!
With building done, it was time for painting. Classic green from Folk Arts multi-surface line was used for the main portion of the locomotive. For the rusty red parts, I originally opted to use a bright red, but it looked wrong, so I later switched to a more accurate color mix using red, orange, and brown paint. To mimic the effects of the side plates I previously had tried to make, I opted to paint the chassis block that held the larger wheels rusty red instead of the standard black that the chassis block usually is. The insides of the wheels were also painted to a very pleasing effect, but make no mistake, the red on top of the already painted black was incredibly hard to achieve. Better enjoy it. Lining was sloppily applied with paint pens and a number plate was made in MS Paint. Yes, MS Paint. It's actually useful for this kind of stuff. I couldn't find a typeface that had a 3 like on the number board that was on the show, so I had to modify an existing font. Decals for the tender were also made in paint, as well as the crest, which was mostly freehand and based off the Ertl model. Although I wanted this model to be faceless, I decided for fun to paint Molly's face as an alternate expression. In fact, Molly's face build was super similar to one of the only official depictions of the city of Truro that actually had a face from a magazine story. It was primed with Tamiya Gray primer, and everything else was painted on using a toothpick and folk art paint. And lastly was adding a finish to the model. For a change, I went with Krylon Gloss Finish, and it worked really great. I was originally going to use Mod Podge Gloss because that's my go-to, but I opted not to as I found paper decals usually absorb the Mod Podge gloss rather than use it as a finish. Luckily, the paper did not absorb the Krylon gloss and got the exact finish that I was hoping for. And with that, it's time for a reveal.
It was an important day in the yard. Everyone was busy and excited, making notes and taking photographs. A special visitor had arrived and was now the center of attention. "Who is that?" whispered Thomas to Duck. "That," said Duck proudly, "is a celebrity. A celebrity is a very famous engine." "Oh," said Thomas, "he's probably too famous to even notice us." "Puh," said Gordon. "Who cares? A lot of fuss about nothing, if you ask me."
Despite the model's slightly awkward height as presented in some of that video footage, I'm quite pleased at how this turns out, and it's a unique take on a very unique locomotive. But just like in the show, the best part of the locomotive allows me to do this classic reading.